my cell phone.
The broadcast has now started.
9 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and open the meeting. Welcome to the members and to the folks that are here from the public. I just want to encourage everyone who is speaking to speak up, because I've heard that the folks that are listening remotely are having a really hard time understanding us. So to the extent we can remember during our discussions to speak up, that would be really good. Okay, the first thing on the agenda is the approval of the minutes, and I didn't know if anybody had any comments, and if not, could I have a motion to approve?
I'll make the motion.
Okay, thank you. All right, and a second?
Second.
All right, thank you. So the minutes are approved. Thank you very much. So I think we have a lot to talk about today, and so we all got copies of the draft solid waste management plan that reflects a lot of work by the staff. They worked to include or deal with the comments that we all had the last time, and I thank you guys for that. And I'm just gonna, open it up. I guess to start with, maybe suggestions on how you want to approach this. Going page by page in this particular case may not be the best way, so just let's go for it. So, do you want to? Anybody?
I'll just say something. We've seen the bulk of this, right? And we've talked about it, commented on it. So when I read it, there wasn't a lot of changes from what we've already seen. I didn't have a lot of changes, edits, input. I've got a few comments, but I think going page by page is okay. At least provide direct feedback. I don't know what others think. I don't think we'll take that long.
I was just going to say, I've got little things like, adding a defined term or something, and I was planning on just sending that to the staff later as a red line, if that's useful, instead of bringing up all those little things today. I was really interested in talking about the priorities in particular.
Talking about what?
The priority items that are listed at the end. That's something I'd love to dig into, with the substance.
I mean, I've done the same thing you've done, and I could do that as well.
I guess maybe it's a question to the staff. What would they prefer for little things like small grammatical?
Yeah, that's the kind of stuff the red line would be perfect.
There's a couple of things I'd like to just clear up in the report that are stated that I don't think are accurate. So I'm thinking that is more in a conversation. I'd rather not send it comments to the staff and then they look at it and say, oh, this is great from Steve, but no one else may agree to it. So I think those are things at least we should talk about.
Well, if that's the case, then I mean, there's something to be said about going through it and sort of massaging some things, so when we get to the priorities, we know what we're all about. But why don't we just go to the back of the document for starters? And I guess I didn't tell them I was going to do this, but is there anything that the staff or Director Wimsatt or anybody want to say about the process here that they thought they wanted to share with us? No?
At the back of the document?
No, just so what you did is you went through the draft, you added your own thoughts, you did things that we had requested. I mean, is there anything that you want to share about it? Just going into it.
Sure thing.
As a general statement.
I think I would just say that, first of all, we really appreciate the tremendous input that we've received from the Solid Waste Working Group and that we expect to receive moving forward here. Also important to understand that document, that the statute gives us a lot of guidance on what the document is supposed to do and what its content is supposed to be, and we're certainly guided by that as well. I think taking off on what Steve said, if any members here have inputs that they think may be unique to their own view or just may not be shared by everybody, this meeting is a great forum for sorting that out, because he's right. If your folks send us stuff that is really maybe a fundamental change, and we only got it from one person, and we don't have a forum for sort of discussing it, that makes it hard for us to know how we do, whether we want to or whether we should be amending the plan. So, and you know, again, keeping in mind that the statute gives us pretty clear direction on what this plan is supposed to look like and what content it's to have and what its goals are. So we're obviously guided by that, regardless of what anyone on this group or members of the public may have to say during public comment. That's sort of a template that and there's a lot of room within that. That's a template that we have to honor, because obviously we can't create a plan that doesn't reflect what the statute directs us to do.
Well, it's hard to know how to tackle this, but why don't we go ahead and start on page 17, which is the summary, and in some ways, I mean, the short-term actions to be completed promptly are the things that we think are top priorities coming out of this process and coming out of the plan. And so, let's just talk about it. I mean, were there things here that people agreed with, disagreed with, thought that they should be restated? The question that the staff had was, in addition to the list of top priorities, they were wondering about a timeline. So, you know, I'll just start out by asking for comments, and then we can take it from there. I mean, I have some broad overarching ideas, but that'll just evolve as we go along. So I did want to make one comment, just so people know. I mean, I personally have been anxious to be able to bring things that are in the biennial report about capacity and that sort of thing more into this document, and the staff has been working very hard on this. I understand the biennial report is in process, but I assume that it will be done in time to include some more of that data in this document.
We would anticipate it would be done by the end of August.
Okay.
All right. To the extent that there's data in there that's appropriate for inclusion, we can certainly
Yeah.
consider that.
Okay, all right.
Karen, with regard to the summary items, which I think in general are fine, but some of the statements are kind of broad. So like, and I'm not sure the plan gets into what that detail is or sets the framework for the detail for DES to do. So for example, on the first bullet, completing a statewide waste characterization and waste generation study. I don't think we say what that is necessarily in the goals. At least, you know, reading through it, it doesn't pop out at me. I know we need to look at toxicity and some other things, but so we have a statement of doing something. I'm not sure where it's actionable in a goal.
I think I see it on page 13.
Yeah, it is
Action
in
4.4, midway down.
So if that's the case, then maybe you know, for people like me that aren't seeing that relationship, there needs that somehow that relationship is either made earlier on or stronger inside the document.
So that ties in exactly to some of my comments on this. Like, for example, the waste characterization and waste generation study are action 4.4, and so I was wondering if, you know, as you mentioned, some of the summary items are very specific. So for that first one, we can put in parentheses action 4.4 or something, so people can refer back up to it in the plan. And then I wondered, in the plan itself, do we want to bold, maybe somehow call out as you're reading through the plan that 4.4 is a top priority, short-term priority. Otherwise, I think I added it up, there's 65 actions, and otherwise as you read the plan, it's really not clear until you get down to the end, what are our top priorities for the short term. So I also was wondering if we want to take the summary and move it up higher in the document, because it's not even so much a summary, because you didn't know until you got to the end that 4.4 was a priority action. So I almost wondered if you could go up higher to the top to an executive summary or something like that.
So yes, 4.4 is a specific one, but like for example, the fourth one, establishing administrative rules to increase compliance with hauler registration and reporting requirements. Actually, I wasn't clear where that one was in the document. I wasn't sure where that came from, and I looked around. So I wasn't seeing a specific action that tied to it. I wasn't entirely clear what that one is intended to achieve.
So could this document do the classic thing, as you said, executive summary, this is what I'm going to tell you, then the report tells you, and then you leave the summary, this is what I told you. Might be useful.
Well, I like the idea of tying in the summary, tying it back to a specific action or actions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot here, and you can like forget what you read.
Right, oh, absolutely.
True, I think that's a good idea, what you stated. It puts it right up front. To Reagan's point, you just know what the priorities are as you're reading through, and you have that in front of you.
I know I struggled, I'm kind of a newbie to this, but I struggled with how detailed should we be? You know, a lot of it is general, it's maybe a plan should be general, but then any one of these sub-bullets strikes me as we have to have kind of a specific scope of work with, you know, how do we go after that funding, for example, or like you said, do we characterize the waste and then do we say, because we want to know about tucks, you know what I mean, somewhere there needs to be a better roadmap, I think, and I don't know if the plan is the right place, I don't know where you put that, but how do we put some meat on the bones?
Yeah, I do want to mention with regard to that second bullet, that's a late edit that didn't make it in there. As much as we wish and expect to do those things, if you look at it to be completed promptly, that is in many respects out of our control. So I don't think that second bullet, there may be a version of that in there, but it won't read like that, because the idea is, well, if we don't do that in 6 months, we already failed. And I think that's setting the whole program up for failure, because we can't control where the funding comes from. We have a lot of ideas about how we're going to pursue funding, but we don't get to decide unilaterally whether we get it from anybody, whether it's a grant giver or the legislature or anywhere else. So that, I apologize, was an edit that was supposed to get in there that was late and didn't make it.
So instead, where it says short-term actions to be completed promptly, it might be more accurate to say, these are what we have identified as the top priorities that need to be addressed. We don't know how quickly they can be addressed, but we still think it's a top priority, because I for one, would be very disappointed if this plan doesn't say somewhere in here that we need funding to...
Absolutely,
yeah.
and don't misunderstand me. My point is that to say promptly accomplish this
Exactly.
right off the bat is not, it doesn't really reflect reality. So we need to, we'll be working,
Yeah.
we'll be working to wordsmith that a little bit.
The overall summary, that's section 3, really? Page 6. Page
I don't
6.
think.
I was wondering about that too, the themes. How do the themes of the plan relate to the priorities of the plan? And there's some overlap. How are they different?
I think the themes describe all the main topics that we're addressing in the plan.
Right.
The priorities are things that we ostensibly identified for early action. And it's a 10-year plan, so not everything is going to have early action necessarily, or certainly not the same degree of early action. But I completely agree with the earlier comment about stating the priorities early on and then restating them at the end. I think that makes a lot of sense.
I just want to clarify what you said, Mike. So are you thinking that we don't have short-term actions to be completed promptly in that prefatory language, or are you talking about removing the second bullet entirely?
I think there's some benefit to identifying both short-term actions and still articulating the highest priorities. And they may be, you know, the short-term actions is a smaller list of things that we have a little more control over, that we look to implement promptly. Priorities can still be, you know, stand out above some of the other overarching themes on page 6, but we'll recognize that that's a, you know, securing and maintaining sustainable funding is a full-time job that goes on forever in any program, right? So it may be a priority, but I don't think it'll be a short-term action.
I see.
Would it make sense instead of the summary to have prioritization of the actions? So you have short-term, ongoing, medium, long range. Maybe that gets built into the summary, but at least it puts a framework about what is going on. With the caveat that, this gets reviewed and those priorities can change because things change. But at least at this point, these are the items you can bite off right now, and here's where you're working towards. That might help frame some of the other things we're talking about.
Well, I mean, I think just we need overarching priorities regardless of what the timing is, and then we can identify, because this, I hadn't focused on that so much, but this is really short-term priorities, and we need big-time priorities spelled out.
I think what we were trying to do with the short-term priorities is that, everybody works in organizations or programs that have a long-term plan, that have a plan, this is by statute, this is a 10-year plan. And I think everybody's experienced that, they do their work and they're focusing on the day's events, and they look back at their plan and they realize, that after it got done, it got put on a shelf and nobody really worked on it. And we thought that by putting short-term priorities in this, it will keep it front and center with us. It will keep us focusing on that and paying attention to what our plan is. And so I think, Eric's idea of, ranking priorities high, medium, and low, they're all important, right? That's why they're priorities. But I think that almost gives us a bit of a timeline to where we might focus our work. So I think there's a lot of merit to that.
That actually fits a question I think Paige or maybe the staff put on, should we have a timeline? That was one of the questions you asked us. I like them personally, but they don't have to be in stone, but would that be helpful?
I think, what I was gonna say is that sentence that Paige had a comment on, that Mike, you had a comment, Ray, you weighed in on short-term actions to be completed promptly. And then your question is, should we have, timetables and whatnot? My concern is similar to yours, not all these are in your control. And if you put out a timeline, and here's the goals, and for certain reasons, some of these goals don't get met, then the plan's a failure. I don't want to say that, but someone's going to dig into this and say, look, they established these priorities and they only met 3 of them out of 6 or something. So I'd be a little hesitant. I think we should reword it similar to what you stated. These are priorities that we feel should be focused on, but short-term goals to be completed promptly is really not in your control in some cases. So it's a kind of a nuance, but I think it's kind of an important one.
I agree. My question is this plan for the state of New Hampshire, or is this plan for DES? Because I feel like we're accomplishing, two different things here. We're talking about what do we recommend as the plan for the state, and here are the pieces that DES has control over. But then there's other pieces that DES doesn't have control over that are also still really important for the state, right? We're creating recommendations for what legislation should be looked into. You guys don't control that. So it just seems like somehow we need to adjust the wording to make it clear the distinction. We can have short-term priorities that we think need to be addressed and maybe spell out which ones are within DES's control, and maybe you do want a timeline for those ones. But the ones out of your control, the best we can do is say, we still think it's really important for the state to work on these, and here's who the point agency or group is that we would really like to work on this. So, for example, the funding piece, that's got to go to legislation.
That's
right?
That's a really good point, and we do go to in some length early in the document to state.
Yeah.
This is about, it talks about all the partners and collaborators here that
Right.
accomplish, what happens in solid waste. And the reality is that in some areas of solid waste, DES has very little influence on what happens. It's a market-driven, sort of animal, if you will. So I think that's a really good point. And I think maybe if we identify issues for prompt action that DES can accomplish, that being very explicit about that makes sense. And there may be things that we recommend be done promptly that are going to take a partnership, a lot of collaborators working on it, and we should identify that as well.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And it gets to Paige's earlier, comment about, do we list out who the parties are? To some degree, it's already done pretty well throughout the document. I just think at the end where we're kind of bringing it all together, and it's a little more vague. Yeah, I'd love to see. What I'd love to see is for us to end up with a document where those short-term priorities were really clear whether or not they get met. Right? If we look at this in 2 years, has the priority been met or not? I think completing a statewide characterization plan and generation studies, we'll know if those have been done or not. That will be crystal clear if those are able to be accomplished or not. But some of these other ones, I mean, obviously the funding one is a big challenge, but you know, gathering more comprehensive data by revising the contents of annual facility reports, do we know what data we need? Is the short-term action actually to do a thorough review of what data is needed, and then the staff come up with a recommendation for how the annual report should be modified? Like, that's a really concrete, you know what I mean? I'm just trying to get as concrete as possible at the end here, because we've got our 65 actions, and I'd love for us to be able to really clearly show in a certain number of years what has and has not been achieved. And to do that, we have to be very specific about measurable goals.
Mark Morgan just made a comment saying that long-range consideration should be included about like future technology, waste conversion technology. So that was just a comment he had.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I couldn't make it in person today. I like the discussion that's being had right now about the goals elements, and I feel like this comment is very very basic, but using the SMART, S-M-A-R-T acronym, you know, when looking at these goals, because they're moderately specific, but using terms like reduce, increase are not the next word, which is measurable, except to say that we reduced it even slightly. I think this group is more interested in greater reductions, and I think that's the legislative mandate is a specific reduction. And then to Reagan's point about achievable, and some things that Mike's been saying too about who's doing what, I think is critical, and just using that as an outline almost when responding to, because the last one is time bound, and that could address some of this long-term, short-term, because the plan currently doesn't outline a specific timeline. So those are just my thoughts.
I think that's good input.
Yeah.
Jim?
I worked in project management for a lot of years, okay? And the first thing I'm going to tell you is this whole thing needs a timeline, all right? And things that you talked about, Reagan, is, you know, they need to be milestones in there. If it's something that you don't have control of, it needs to have an action. It needs to have, because in those milestones, like if this does go to rules, then you're going to want members of this committee to go testify at rules. Well, how do you get people to go to testify at rules? You talk about it in the meeting that you're going to have right before rules comes up or the legislation comes up. So all of that stuff needs to be in a timeline. And when you start putting that stuff in a timeline, you're going to see the order of which those actions have to be. But overall, you need to assign those action items to an individual or an individual organization, or it's not going to happen. Because, oh, I thought he was doing it. I thought they were doing it. Okay, so you need to take, I'm sure that you've got some resources in project management in the staff. They need to take this thing and they need to put that timeline together, but it needs to be assigned to specific people, okay? And all of those other things that you need input from outside, they need to be in there too, because not only do they have the responsibility, I'm on rules. I certainly will get this thing when I may not be on rules by then, but you know, right now I am on rules, okay? But one of the things that influences what goes into those rules is who's testifying. How does that rule affect? How does that rule do different things? So you need somebody with project management experience and the knowledge of the subject to sit down and actually do that timeline, look at dependent and independent actions, when they should fit in your timeline, and go from there. And at some point, you know, maybe not when this thing is issued, but a year down the line, you print it as an addendum to this, or an addendum to your minutes. And now I'll go back and listen.
Oh, well, those are really good points, and your addendum idea in particular is good, because it might be, they can maybe scope out the timing in a general way, because we got to get this done by October 1st, but I'm sure as an agency they'll be driving to sort of pin some of the actions down.
Sure, all of those things that Senator Gray described are things that we would do as part of our more granular plan to get certain things done. I'm not sure, as you say, how much can go into the plan, but certainly those are things that, and sure, I appreciate your comment about publishing something as an addendum, because, you know, 10-year time frame is a long time frame. A lot of inputs and information and situations can change during that time, and it may well be appropriate to, you know, I see this as a plan that could be amended and added to within that 10-year period.
I think that's sort of what we've been anticipating. We have a lot of charges still as a group from the legislation that we've got to work on. So, anyways, well, just to try to get a direction here, then, why don't we start with the short-term goals, and then let's get to the big stuff, you know, the priorities and how we're going to work that through. Does that make sense? So if you look on page, whatever this is, 17, are these reasonable short-term goals? Are there short-term goals that you think we should add to this?
Just, if I could just add a specific thing, following up on the discussion about funding. I think what could be, it probably should be a prompt short-term goal, is for us to pursue available EPA grant funding, which we know is going to be coming available, you know, right about the same time this plan is published. So I think that's something that we absolutely plan to do, and that should be identified and is appropriately identified as a short-term goal. The larger issue of ongoing funding, reliable over time, that's both a daily job and a job that goes on over the years, right? So I think that's something I would rather see as a medium and long-term goal. But for a short-term funding goal, certainly pursuing EPA grant funding for, you know, and that's still evolving, literally
Right,
as we
we don't
speak.
have the guidelines, right?
We've got a pretty good idea that it's going to be potentially providing some funding to states that could be used for the kind of, you know, for the other goals here, like doing, you know, the funding we might need to launch a statewide study, a waste characterization study. That may well be something that we could seek funding for. And also, looking at our partners, we expect there will be funding not necessarily available to DES, but available to a variety of public sector and potentially private sector solid waste entities for accomplishing certain goals relative to increasing diversion and recycling.
So that second bullet, instead of securing, would it be pursuing? Maybe not.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Now, the securing part is the part I can't control.
Right.
But certainly pursuing, and you know, I think we could, if we want to be specific, pursuing available federal grant funding for both.
Should we limit it to federal though, or do we really?
Well, it's a prompt action, so
Yeah.
I mean, again, it's something I know that we can do.
who's responsible, when does it have to be done? That's the part you're missing in here. You got a goal. Who's responsible? When does it have to be done?
DES and in 2023 for what I just discussed.
And I would suggest that you add that.
All of these things are pretty much DES, aren't they?
Well, we tried to make them pretty much DES, sure, because those are the things that we can promptly work on.
Right.
So, to Regan's point, and I think this is a plan for the state, but it's actionable by DES. Because it's there. You know, when you read the first thing, it's DES wrote this plan, so it's their ownership.
But a
In-
lot
in
of
the-
it is not under their control. I mean, I don't know.
Well, they do the action or initiate the action. So in that respect, it is under their control. Whether it can be, that action can be, or that goal can be fulfilled is a different story. Like, if there is no funding, there is no funding.
Some of this discussion triggers a question I guess I had in my own mind. It relates to, again, Paige's thing on page 7. Who are the entities? You know, it said allocate tasks to specific entities. I was just curious, would it be helpful in here or somewhere to not necessarily only have the hierarchy triangle, but have how does New Hampshire function in solid waste? You know, I'm from bigger states where there's a local health department component, there's a large waste management district component. I think we have those, right? So a lot of those boil down to DES, but is there anybody else? I mean, the question kind of triggered in my head, are you thinking there's other entities that exist here that we would allocate tasks to and then incentivize them to do them? You know what I mean? I don't see the roadmap for the whole state. Is it just DES? And if it is, maybe we should say that. Yeah, please.
Well, I was going to say there are a number of places in the actions where other entities are specifically called out. Like action 1.3 talks about health and human services. 1.4 talks about, collaborating with Department of Administrative Services. So a number of them do, not all, but a number of them do. And I think to many points that are raised, the more specific we can be about naming who those collaborating partners are might be good, just to be more specific. But it is in a number of spots.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I didn't catch that. And I'm assuming, much like legislation, those would be out of the control of DES, right? You could solicit collaboration or MOAs or something, but you can't necessarily tell these other entities to do anything. Is that fair? Or?
Well, I think it's fair to say, obviously we don't control whether legislation passes or not, but we influence it by requesting our legislators to propose bills that we think are important, or by supporting or testifying bills that are in play in the legislature. I think that much of what this plan will do is it's definitely DES is the key player, right? I mean, we're directed by the statute to draft the plan and to implement the plan, and there are partners to be sure. An example would be one of the things that we can influence but can't make happen necessarily is this. I don't remember where it's located, but a goal of trying to get transition from this sort of popular but inefficient method of doing household hazardous waste collection through individual grants to communities, and transitioning to a condition where we have a series of fixed household hazardous waste collection sites located regionally throughout the state, so that any resident in the state has one that's not too far away, and they don't have to wait a year to bring their household waste to a cleanup day. That's something we've had really just incremental early conversations with the regional planning commissions. I think they will be key partners in that. And in the end, municipalities or individual communities that come together will be key partners in that. But obviously that's not going to happen all on its own. It's going to take DES trying to maybe pursue funding, maybe provide to the extent we're have the ability to do it, incentive grant funding to do, you know, and we could do that because that's one thing we talked about. We spend a lot of money every year subsidizing these household collections, and if we took that money and put it into incentivizing these regional collection centers, it's a lot more cost effective, a lot more efficient, and it's a lot safer too because it means people really have a regular way of disposing of their household waste. But again, that's a variety of partners that could include private sector municipalities and regional planning commissions, but DES is going to play a role in that. So I think that we almost have at least a hand in almost everything that happens.
Right.
But and maybe sort of an incentivizing hand to the extent we can incentivize it, or a legislative hand and going to the legislature and saying we can't make this happen, but there needs to be a law that helps guide this particular topic in a certain direction. So I think we're always there, but I think it is appropriate for the plan to identify who those partners and collaborators need to be, because really everybody that reads this plan needs to figure out where they fit in it and how they can help advance it. Because if the only people who read it or try to advance it are DES staff, not much is going to happen. We need to have all the partners pulling in the same direction.
And may I add to that, you know, as an organization that's hoping to be assisting with education and outreach and technical assistance, it would make my life easier when applying for grants for things that I know are going to advance this plan. It'd be easier if, you know, I can point to very specific areas in which there's needs, and how, you know, for example, the Northeast Resource Recovery Association is identified as a potential partner organization. It makes it much easier then for all those partners to then do their piece too. So I see this as being a great foundational document for, you know, at least for our organization to apply for grants in the future to help advance some portions of this plan.
Yeah, those kind of mentions can be very powerful for grant application. Absolutely.
Okay, so as we're looking at the short-term goals, is there something else that you feel should be added? I mean, my comment, I had one on the assisting municipalities. Maybe the concept of development of tools is built into the word assisting, but I feel like it's really important that the agency develops some good online tools that can be used not only by municipalities but other entities, like good ways of recycling, resource materials, things like that. I think that they could be really handy, and I sort of track back to like what Vermont does. The agency helps develop a lot of tools, and then those things can be plugged easily into municipal and business websites as need be. And I think that would go a long way to help people understand what they want to do when they want to reuse or recycle or avoid using something. And then as a short-term goal, I mean, we've talked a lot about legislation. I mean, should we have something in here about pursuing necessary legislation? I mean, I don't know. Or if the DES wants to say that they'll do it. I mean, I'm glad you've talked about this, because I've wondered a little bit about to what extent DES would try to initiate some actions to pursue goals.
Let me weigh in on that one.
Okay.
Why not have it that this solid waste working group will develop draft legislation to be presented, okay? That gives you an actionable item, okay? Something that has to happen here, and since you've got legislators on here, as long as you can convince them that the plan is the right, then it will get put in as an LSR. What happens to it after that? But wording it that you are going to have this committee develop the draft legislation, okay, not necessarily just the department, again, gets you a group of people to testify when the legislation comes up.
will say from a timing standpoint, we don't have a lot of time between now and when things have to be put in, but,
Look, if you're the one that's gonna be putting it in as the prime sponsor, which would normally be since you're the chair.
Yeah.
Okay, we can word it such that you can write a revision to it, an amendment to it, to change it afterward, but, you know.
well, and I would say the DES also should talk with us about things that if we're not thinking about it, or, you know, let's have a discussion about it. But I'm trying to figure out the timing of that because the plan is coming out October 1st.
Are we talking about a particular thing we're trying to accomplish through legislation, or just generally about legislation?
Well, we'll see what falls.
Is there anything that this plan or the implementation of that plan would require a change in legislation? Okay? Certainly the budget is part of
Yes.
legislation. Okay? It wouldn't be in this particular, LSR, but do you have the power? You talk about rules in here. Do you have the power that you need in rules? Does it give you the authorization to establish those rules right now? And if it does give you the power, then is it worded such that, the mays and the shalls and everything are in the right places? Those are all kinds of things that at some point, when we look at implementing this, that the legislation has to support it.
I think the answer to that is it depends on what specific thing you're trying to accomplish. I mean, generally, we have appropriate authority and mandates under the statute to accomplish certain things. To the extent that this group or the agency or in tandem, we develop an idea that we want to change that framework in some way, then that's probably only accomplished through legislation. In terms of the more detailed things that we're looking at, the things we identify for prompt action here for rulemaking, we believe we have the rulemaking authority for that.
So in bullet 4, which says establish administrative rules to increase compliance, you looked at that and you say, yeah, I've got the authority already.
Right.
And the mays and the shalls are all in the right spots.
So we believe for that particular topic. I do think we need to remember this is a 10-year plan that needs to stay a little bit high level. If the plan really just identifies, let's do this legislation in 2022 or 2023, that's not really what the plan is. And we can have short-term actions, and frankly, if we had a particular topic that we were all in agreement and the agency felt needed to be advanced through legislation in 2023, that could be a short-term action or a short-term recommendation.
But the short-term action could be a yearly action to develop legislation.
That is true all the time. Yeah, I don't think there's been a year when there hasn't been solid waste legislation in play.
I think this will be a year, there will be more.
I'm pretty sure that. Can I throw something out?
Yeah.
Senator got a great point, really, from an implementation standpoint. What he said, I agree 100%. We need to do that. That's a lot to put in this plan.
Yeah.
Maybe an action item in this plan is to do just that. That after the plan gets developed, we've got a short time frame, that the DES, the committee, whoever, somebody puts together a roadmap to implement these short-term priorities at least, or maybe a short, mid, however we set this up, but maybe that itself is an action item.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Because we don't have the time, and you really need to drill into each of these items.
Right.
And it gives the state staff members some time to develop what needs to get done and to think through it. That could be an action item.
It can even be a short-term priority. And we don't have to worry about the legislation bullet. I just wanted to raise it.
Duncan wanted to comment on something. So
Okay,
he
go
said
ahead.
it's unmute. Duncan, I don't know. Okay, here you go.
Yeah, so this is one of those examples of a meeting where it's totally a disadvantage to not be in the room here, and just the audio, frankly, is a little garbled, and I'm catching fragments of conversation. conversations, but I'm getting the gist of it. But my apologies for not being able to attend. I had a conflicting meeting that I couldn't get out of, and so here I am. But one of the things that I see as being talked about, you know, is sort of putting this plan together. And at our last meeting, our technical subcommittee suggested something about, you know, an actionable item, which could easily be a short-term goal or fit within the goals 3 or 6. But it talked about an issue. There's the DES issuing an RFP for an advanced materials recovery facility, and I don't see that anywhere in the report. You know, it's given passing allusion to with regard to, you know, infrastructure, but you know, I'm going to beat this dead horse until somebody actually listens to this. But if we're not talking about infrastructure in a real way, this report is meaningless. And I think the state can be the broker in with regards to, you know, facilitating this. I mean, it doesn't commit anybody to anything. It doesn't cost any money to ask the private sector for what we want. And you know, I think that, you know, without that, you know, and putting something out there that says this is what we want, and then the private sector comes back and says this is what we can give you, well, then municipalities can then decide whether they want to participate in such a program or not. But without that, I'm afraid that, you know, this is just going to be another piece of paper that's going to end up on a shelf and doesn't really do much good to move the needle at all, which is what we're trying to do here, move the needle.
Duncan, can I respond to you? Can you hear me? This is Steve.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, hi. I don't necessarily disagree with you, but I think from a practical standpoint, if the state puts out an RFP, who's going to be the host of that facility? You've got to go to a community, you know, for, you know, a large recycling facility that's going to service a good portion of the state. It's got to be centralized. If that's Concord or that's Manchester. Are those municipalities on board with saying, Manchester, yes, we want a regional single stream facility built somewhere? So I think if we're going to go that pathway, down that road, you know, maybe one of the actions are, maybe that's a follow-up item, is to look at what municipalities may be interested in hosting something like that. I mean, we're just completing a single stream processing facility at Rochester to replace one that we're taking down. And we're doing that because we're there and it's easy. We've got a host community that is willing to work with us. If we were to go into Manchester, it's going to be a multi-year process to educate them and identify property and all of that. So that's something that if we want to do that as a state, we need to identify where the best place for that to happen is. It might be Concord, maybe the Pinnacle plant, something that's centralized. So just a thought, we should throw that out there. Just putting an RFP out might be tough.
So I just have one alteration, is that, you know, the plan needs to be, to your point, it needs to be dynamic. As we get this aggregate data back, it's going to reveal some information, and we need to have the flexibility within the plan to be able to address and adapt to those things that will come out of these studies. So the initial ask is really for studies, and then maybe next year, as who's ever developing the timeline can come back and say, you know, the next step based on aggregate data that comes back in. So as the initial part of the plan, we're looking at studies, but then going on, the plan itself needs to be dynamic to respond to the phase 1, if you will, right? So if we don't do anything till 10 years, or we don't talk about how to plan for the you know, outcome of that data collection, then, you know, what are we doing it for?
And to support what Duncan said, maybe that's the first step. You know, go out initially, identify a location where this could be done, and then have an RFP developed. Go on the street, get, you know, bids, proposals from quasi-municipal organizations or private sector, and then the state can evaluate that. So it's a multi-step process.
And what about state-run facilities? That's what always pops into my mind. You know, we talked about, does the DES have the authority to do that now? No. You know, that's not the legislative directive, but should it be? To me, you know, our neighbor states have that, and we don't.
So let's talk about the possibility of that happening. All right. Let's first though look at UNH, community college system. How does that work for the state doing those? What's your opinion there? Right now, with the way that the state does things, and you know, time after time, legislators come in and say, okay, we're going to do this, and the money we save is going to go in this special account, and that special account is going to be used for this. And what happens? House Bill 2 comes along, and it says, oh, by the way, we need that money somewhere else. Okay? So I, don't want to discourage you too much, but history tells us that if I try to say the state is going to go do this, I'm not very optimistic that it's going to end the way you'd like it.
In no way am I suggesting that the state would own or operate this facility. This is a private sector initiative, but it's a public-private partnership that is necessary in order to make this happen.
Just back to the legislation stuff, the wording of those actions is a little bit concerning. One says explore, and another one says, what is it? Consider. What's DES's role in legislation? Do you write legislation? Do you just comment on it? If it's in the plan, the way I read it was more like you were going to write stuff in, try to get things passed, and I wasn't sure what your role in the legislation is, or is that?
Sure, great question. Any state agency's role in legislation is typically varied. It can be anywhere from deciding something needs to happen, drafting the legislation, and then seeking the support of a legislative member to sponsor it, and then trying to shepherd it through, and really being an active participant and supporter and an advocate for a particular piece of legislation. Similarly, legislation is proposed by legislators on behalf of their constituents. They have nothing to do with the agency, but it may affect the agency's programs or mission, and so we may take a position on the bill or not, depending on the circumstances. So it's really varied. But make no mistake, if there's a clear directive to advance something, the agency can do what any citizen can do, and because of its position, it probably has a little more influence than the average individual citizen, by seeking sponsors and advocating through the legislative process.
So do you want the plan to be more specific?
If I can finish, because that was my setup. But what I also want to note is that this is a 10-year plan, which theoretically could see a time when we could have 5 different governors in New Hampshire. At the end of the day, every state agency is an executive branch agency, and basically their boss is the governor. And so I'm a little bit hesitant to put specific legislative goals in a plan where, right out of the gate or 6 years in, a governor could say, I want to do the opposite of that. I don't want that at all. And so then it's like, oh, well, you had this plan, but you didn't execute it. Well, again, this is a situation where it's, DES doesn't operate unilaterally as an individual for anything. It's an executive branch agency, and it answers its goals and its missions are set by the and its directives are often set by the legislature, and it answers to governors. So that's why when you start talking about very specific legislative ideas to advance in a plan, it's a little bit, unless there's really broad consensus, something that everybody can get their arms around clearly, it's a little bit dicey to do that.
So let me just counter. I mean, we're charged, DES is charged with a plan that looks out 10 years. And there are probably items that you want to support or encourage, and I think that would be reflected in the plan. Now, plans change, and it can be amended, like we talked about. But if there are ideas in here that are supporting the goals, then whether it's, I'm just want to make sure that it's a little loosey-goosey on the legislative side, and I'm just wondering if we wanted it to be more specific, like DES would support a legislation towards this, and it should be independent of who's governor, because because it's the state's plan, how you wanted to set it up, and I just think there needs to be a little more oomph to it, if you will. That's not a really good vocabulary word, but
don't misunderstand me. I don't think that means there should not be discussion of legislation in the plan. I'm just saying that if you get so granular that it's about, this will happen, the ability to make that happen may not be there.
But I'm not saying, that you're gonna have legislation happen. It's you're gonna support legislation to this idea, or because you kind of say that, but it's just consider legislation, which really doesn't mean anything, right? You can consider it, and then okay, we considered it, and like I'm gonna plant a tree. I don't know what kind of tree. I considered it. I'm done. That action is now measurable and achieved. But if we're going to be supporting legislation, whether it's working with legislatures or talking with the Waste Management Council or this group to try to get something through, that's a different action than we have an action I think is an inaction in the plan.
Sort of what you're comfortable with, I think.
Yeah,
As
I
far
mean, I
as
think it's easier to
words.
talk about these things in the specific than it is in the abstract.
Yeah, right.
So
I
if
mean,
you've got a
the-
particular thing you want to include in the plan, I think we should talk about that. But all I was trying to do was explain that, the agency can't necessarily publish a plan saying that in the 2023 session, it's going to support a bill that does this or that, because we may not be in a position to support or advance a bill that does this or that.
So, I mean, the way I read that was that it was a recognition in the plan that there was gonna be legislation necessary to put into effect some of these other action items. And, I mean, I guess I was comfortable with the word explore because you can take the initiative and start exploring. You may not even find a legislator that wants to introduce
But it means you're working.
But it
You
means you're
identified
working
as
on
something
it.
to work on,
But
which I think
the
is
other
appropriate.
thing is that by having that bullet in there, that gives DES and legislators and everybody the high sign that this is something we really are interested in, and is like lays down a marker that it's something that we want to pursue. It's just so hard. You could find a legislator who's interested in one of these action items, but they may not like it exactly the way DES. I mean, it's just a really evolutionary process. So I get what you're saying, but I mean, I'm comfortable. I mean, maybe we could come up with another word, but I think explore is sort of where I would go with
And
it.
the basis for that is a lot of stuff or control that DES has to be legislatively
Right.
driven.
Right.
So if the legislation's not there, then they can't do certain
Right.
things, which might affect other actions, and not just going to the top of the food chain in that regard, where they don't have the legislative authority to make a rule on something.
That's kind of why before I used the word draft.
Right.
Okay? So it gives you more than explore, okay? Gee, yeah, I looked at it, it was Tuesday last week, But if you actually have to produce a product, and that's that piece of draft legislation, I think it gets us a little further.
Well, I mean, some of the things in here for explore legislation is a list like this. So I think actually once we get through our priorities, and I would like to suggest that we get to the big time priorities, because we've spent a lot of time on the small time stuff, that we'll be able to refine a little bit more what legislation this group really wants to get engaged in and push forward, and it might be just 2 or 3, or it might depend. So so I guess, where do you want to go next? Should we go to 6? Those are page 6, those are the overarching themes. We set our goals before, and everything is flowing from the goals that we established before, so we can't really change those at this point. But do you want to talk about the themes?
I had a question on
Yeah.
page 6, the last bullet. The second sentence, I'm not sure it's necessary. In the theme, it talks about,
I feel really strongly that has to be in there, that we have to sort of outline the situation that's been faced with, that DES has been faced with for a while.
Okay, I just didn't see how it added to the plan, that's
Well,
all.
it may not add exactly to the plan, but it supports this very difficult problem, so I'd like to see it stay there. Anybody else on the themes?
Well, I had a question, and I'm not sure, where it belongs, but I want to sort of pick up on where Steve was going. That if somehow the idea of putting an RFP out is premature, that we need a site first, then I don't know that requires legislation, but maybe the DES could be be the broker in trying to find a suitable site to locate an advanced materials recovery facility for this necessary infrastructure. Maybe that could be a short-term goal, and it's not going to take much to do that. I would imagine that economic development authorities would respond to such a thing, and then obviously in consultation with the private sector.
Duncan, this is Mike. I'm a little bit confused about what the RFP would be seeking. We don't have any directive or money to support or specifically support with financial resources, or a directive to site a facility. It's a private market, and we have met recently with someone who is interested in doing exactly what you said, and we were very encouraging to them. But I'm not sure what the RFP, so we issue an RFP, and then we get a bunch of proposals, and then what do we do with them? It's a totally private market, whether people like it or not. That's what it is.
Agreed, Mike, and the reason that I'm even bringing this up is because I'm trying to actually do something here that's making a difference in our diversion of solid waste, and all the stuff that we're talking about are just a bunch of words. There's no action happening here. I mean, I'm sorry, this is just very frustrating to me. Having done this for so long and watched so many opportunities just not be realized. But I guess in answer to your question, Mike, what would the state's role be? I mean, obviously what would have to happen is that whatever package came out of the RFP process, municipalities would have to weigh in as to whether or not they would be interested in participating in such a thing. I mean, I don't know what other vehicle we can use to make this happen. Yes, I agree that yes, there's entities that are interested in this, and Steve's organization's building a new single stream facility. So I think that there's a demand for such a thing, because without the ability to divert these wastes, we're just not going to get where we need to go. And I just think that there's an urgency here that we're not talking about enough, that is specific to climate change, that is driving this. It needs to be moving a lot more aggressively than kicking this can down the road to 2030 or 2050.
I completely agree with you.
At 6 degrees C temperature change by the end of this century, that makes the Earth uninhabitable.
I completely agree with you that we need those kinds of facilities moving forward, and sooner rather than later. All I'm saying is I don't see how the RFP advances that. Because again, usually you put it on an RFP because you're going to do something with it. And we don't have a specific directive or any funding or the ability to, as I think it was Eric mentioned, if it were going to be a public facility or a public-private partnership, we'd have to have a directive from the legislature to do that. So I don't disagree with you that there should be efforts in the plan to advance those kinds of facilities. I just don't know how an RFP accomplishes that when we don't have sort of the underpinnings of why you issue an RFP in the first place.
But what I would say is, if this plan doesn't call out the need for these types of facilities, then I'm concerned that our plan really isn't going to be an action plan to get us where we need to go. Whether it's an RFP or just saying we need the private sector to come in and provide these types of facilities, there needs to be a reference to it specifically in the plan, so that it's in the mix. Because otherwise, it's just out there in the ether, and it's not real.
I agree with that. I think the plan should identify that that's an important aspect. Specifically, how that's worded is important. I mean, we did receive a proposal, or not a proposal, but an inquiry from someone who has one of these advanced recycling facilities, but then we learned that they don't have one anywhere in the world. They have They have a couple of facilities that are components of that, but not the full package. So I'm a little concerned that, you know, it may be a little too ambitious to say we need to have a complete advanced recycling facility in New Hampshire when nobody has one anywhere. And I think that it might be more appropriate to identify slightly less ambitious but more achievable steps, like even just, as you know, we don't currently have a full service MRF in New Hampshire and the lion's share of recyclable materials that get collected in New Hampshire go to out-of-state facilities. And so I think that, you know, just getting maybe perhaps a less sophisticated MRF, at least first in the state, would be a good start. And we don't even have that right now.
Well, should we perhaps, to get to the infrastructure issue, put in the short-term goals something about identify infrastructure vital to support the goals or something like that? I mean, is that an obvious?
Well, I think we do have to explore ways to incentivize the siting of those types of facilities here in the state. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the will of the legislature will be, whether it will want, you know, the legislature in New Hampshire typically has not wanted state government to take a market participant role the way other states have with regard to state-owned landfills and that sort of thing. But at present, it's a little frustrating because we come to work every day and we want to advance those things, but we don't really have a directive from the legislature to make that happen, or even something as simple as a tax incentive or incentive grant funding to say, you know, if you agree to come and site a facility here, we can provide a grant, a one-time grant or an annual grant of this much money to support that. And that's happening in other states for sure, for certain.
Well,
it's
so
not
you
happening.
just listed off something. I mean, could a short-term goal mean just be like develop concepts on incentivization of infrastructure or something like that? I mean, that at least would get at this infrastructure issue. I don't know how you want to structure that, but I think you've heard what Duncan has said, and you guys can consider it. And I mean, I just think as a short-term thing, we probably should have something about infrastructure.
I think one thing we could do, and again, people don't like it because it's maybe a little too nebulous, but it's still important and it can be effective. Explore legislation to incentivize. I mean, we have I'm comfortable. We have a clear directive in the statute to increase diversion, to increase recycling. So we've got that mandate. The question is, how do we accomplish that? And so we would probably need somewhat more direct and explicit legislation that would give us the ability to incentivize or somehow encourage a particular solution. And it could be, those can be in the form of mandates, they can be in the form of incentive grants, they can take a lot of shapes. That's why I say explore legislation, because you don't know at the end of the day what you're going to want to pursue. But at the end of the day, it's how do you, other than just getting a directive from the legislature to increase diversion or increase recycling, getting some kind of directive about how to go about doing that would be really helpful.
Well, if you want to include that as a short term.
I'd like to echo Duncan's sentiments, and I like what Mike is saying right now about identifying areas that kind of go back to what was mentioned earlier about the making sure that DES has authority to do certain things. The current plan, this draft as it's written, is almost looking at assuming nothing changes moving forward for the foreseeable future, what can we do? And in my mind, a plan is not necessarily how do we get there given current technology and regulation, but where do we need to be and how do we get there? So if what we're talking about is waste reduction, and we're all agreeing with that, regardless of what currently exists, we need to identify and agree on those goals first, and then figure out where are those shortcomings and restraints, identify them, and then figure out how do we get around them. I have to agree with Duncan that it is frustrating to be talking about this, and the primary focus of this plan is to educate the public to do better. And I think what we really need to do in the beginning of this session was very enthusiastic about being aggressive, And people look to this plan around the state to see, okay, where are we going? Not just what can we do, but this is an opportunity to identify and create some stretch goals that maybe are a bit out there, but to at least create some muscle and some fortitude and pull up our pants and say, okay, here's where we're going to go. This might be unpopular right now, but we're going to push forward to accomplish this. And the people in this room are the ones to get that done. And I think everybody needs to realize that that's what we're here to do, is not to look at existing regulatory framework and identify ways to reduce waste, but to figure out, okay, we want to reduce waste, how do we do it? And then identify those problem areas and make those changes.
I mean, I applaud Mark for saying that. I mean, I'm not sure a day goes by when I don't get an email or a text or something from some member of the public with a suggestion, with an idea, really bubbling over with enthusiasm about this plan and what the plan can bring for our state. And, you know, I look at it, I feel, I mean, it's all here. I feel like it's lacking heart somehow. I didn't know if I was going to say that, but I'm just going to say it. And I know a lot of people care an awful lot about landfills. I don't see a lot of punch in here about why we're really trying to divert from landfills. We say we've got the goal, but what is it about landfills that make them bad? I mean, you could put in a couple of sentences. I hear all the time from people about plastics. There really isn't much about plastics in here. I feel like we could add some sort of legislative goal or something. But I just want to, and I know you all know this, people have such high hopes for this, and I feel like we just have to try to do the best we can do. And yes, there are going to be some stretch goals in here, and it'll give us something to work toward over time. So that's neither here nor there, I guess, in a way, but I don't want us to be afraid of stretching. I think we need to, and if we don't stretch in here, this is what's going to give the legislators the juice to go forward to try to do some real planning in our state. I mean, it has to come, I think, from the heart and from our passion to do better with this issue. And, you know, I had thought maybe we could put something in here about how we really are being left behind regionally, but that's not in here. I guess we're not comfortable putting it in. You know, anyway, there's a lot of reasons why there's a lot of passion about this. So I just want to echo what Mark said.
I just want to, there's a lot of talk about incentives, okay? New Hampshire's constitution limits very severely what the state can do in incentives for having businesses come in. If you want to really delve into that, you need to look at 79E, which allows people to defer taxes over a period of time when there is a substantial community interest. But remember, those are property taxes, so you know that's down at the local level. Okay, there are ways that certain loans can be guaranteed by the state, and those payments can be diverted, you know, for a period of times. But it is very limited what you can do because of the way the Constitution is worded about public-private partnerships and the public paying for something that is going to benefit a particular company. So, you know, before you start going out there and saying incentives, yeah, oh, gee, that's where I want to go, it's pretty hard to use incentives the way the state has limited them per the Constitution.
Senator, I just wanted to make sure I address this because I think that sometimes it can get easily confused with what we're actually talking or what I'm actually talking about. The city of Keene, as an example, operates a special.
Duncan, you cut out.
Hopefully he's not still talking. I'm saying, solving the whole problem right now. Nobody here is gonna find out in 5 minutes that no one's here. That's all I have to say about it.
Things happen. I am in no way suggesting that what we should be doing. I recognize the limitations of the state. I've been operating with them for a long time, and I think that there is a model that we can use because, frankly, I run a $4 million operation in the city of Keene. It's a very small operation in the overall scheme of things, but it's still $4 million of materials going through my facility, both incoming and outgoing. And so a public-private partnership to me means that, I don't have to invest any capital in an infrastructure that's provided by the private sector. What I have to do is I have to pay for the service that's ultimately being offered by the private sector if I choose that that's the best option for me. So when I say a public-private partnership, that's really what I'm referring to, that if the private sector comes up with a solution that makes some sense, that, the sense for the goals of the city of Keene, which, are and honestly, more aggressive than the state's goals, but, I can't achieve this on my own. I need the private sector in order to be able to accomplish this, and that's through the infrastructure. The way I pay for it is the users of the system, through tipping fees or what have you, pay for the operation of these facilities. So that it's not new money. In fact, frankly, it represents an opportunity for some savings for my community members, because I think, frankly, that the costs of this type of infrastructure will be less than what I'm paying for right now.
Okay. All right, guys, I'm sort of at a loss of what to do next here. I thank you, Duncan, and I think the agency has heard you, and we'll try to. I mean, we got to get something about infrastructure in here, maybe as a short term.
Can I just say
Yeah,
that
sure.
you had mentioned kind of the context, the regional context in which we're operating in, and I agree that should be in the plan here. I'm not seeing it as well, and I think we've talked about, we had presentations about, waste sheds. We're operating in a waste shed, particularly with our reliance on the private market, and if we lack that context in this plan, I think we're missing something huge.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a dirty word to talk about out-of-state waste, but what's everybody freaking out about? But, the regional efforts to decrease waste, and then, here we sit, and it's not really in here either. I mean, I think we're gonna have some more about landfills. Anyways, to set the context a little bit more, I think that's what people are looking for, and I realize it's an agency document, and anyway, okay.
Can I just one last thing on the technology? Like Mike was talking about, they got a really good idea, but they've got party over here, party, but nothing's together. We can't discount the technology we have today. It's gonna I'm saying move the needle, but you're gonna gain by using the technology that already exists right now. So that shouldn't be left behind in this.
True, and we have to promote those as well.
Right.
To be used better. So do we think going to the overarching themes makes sense? I mean, we had the short-term priorities, we have our goals. If we really want to have like overarching priorities, we've got to figure them out or use them, or just use the goals that we have in here. I'm not really sure how people want to go about this at this point. Do you want to look at the themes? Did people have any comments on those?
Are we going to have another bite of this apple in August?
So we can talk about that at this point. Basically, jumps ahead a little bit on the schedule. Why don't one of you talk about the schedule so people understand where we are at this point?
Mike, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So we have a deadline of October 1st. We all know that. We are required by statute to make the plan available for public comment. That's also needs to be a reasonable amount of time. So if we back up from October 1st, probably the month of August will need to be open for public comment. So after this meeting, the idea is that we're going to have to turn around as an agency pretty quickly and issue a document that can be, made available for the public so that they have a reasonable amount of time to comment on it. We're thinking probably about 3.5 weeks, 4 weeks, something like that. Because whatever comments we get, we're going to need to have time to consider. So this month of September is going to be crunch time for us in terms of looking at the comments we got, making any adjustments to the document, and issuing it by October 1st. And there's a lot of steps that are going to be kind of compressed into the month of September for us internally in terms of review, getting it publication ready. So we have a really compressed timeline, so we're going to do the best that we can to receive public comment, consider thoughts and ideas from stakeholders across the state. But that's kind of the idea right now, is that hopefully by the first week of August we can issue this plan out, get public comment for at least 3 weeks, and then have the month of September to really work on finalizing.
So you want to issue this to the public next week?
Correct. Yep.
Right.
So to Duncan's question, his next bite of the apple is public comment.
Well, we can talk about that, but my thought was that while this is out for public comment, we won't meet in August. Because we might as well let the staff get the public comment, synthesize it, and then the next time we would come together would be to review that synthesized draft. And if we use the date that we have right now, I think it's sometime in September, like the 23rd, I don't know what it is. If they're trying to get this out by October 1st, there's not a lot of time there. We could move up the September meeting, I guess, but I'm not sure the staff will have adequate time to get the public comment in.
With respect, I think that we need to get out there for a period of public comment. Entirely appropriate and welcome for all the solid waste working group members to provide whatever comment throughout that time or at the end, when that comment period comes to a close. After that, we're going to need to come, as an agency, we're going to need to take all that, everything we've gotten from the solid waste working group members and all the members of the public, and put that into a document. And I think our ability to respond to any thoughts of this group,
I agree.
the 3rd or 4th week of September
is impossible.
Near zero.
Right.
So, and I just want to be really clear communicator about that. So I think that to the extent that we will do our best to incorporate this discussion into an amended draft. I'm not sure how much we can change it. Just again,
Before you put it out to
we've
public.
got to get it out. I don't want
I
to
agree
do a
with you.
shortchange the public and say, oh, you only get a week to look at this. So we want to get this out there and get people's input. And then I think that really, realistically, if you're a member of this group, today and the next few weeks during the public comment period are your window to get your input on this. And then we are going to issue this plan on time. That's the only thing I can tell you for sure.
Well, yeah.
So our specific comments, like wordsmithing and whatever we talked about at the very beginning, get that to you guys now. And then whatever you can incorporate for the draft, you might be able to incorporate for the final.
Absolutely. No, I think anything that a lot's been said today, and there may be components of this that will go into the next few days to getting this draft out the door. But that's not lost. We'll have the opportunity to be still working on this throughout the public comment period, and in the month that follows that public comment period, and then we'll go to publication. And again, keep in mind, it's not as though it's being chiseled into a granite slab. If 2 years down the line this group says, you know what, we got something wrong, we can talk about that and we can amend the plan. And, there's nothing it says we got to issue it every 10 years. It doesn't say we can't change it.
Right, which is we're relying on. Well, so Mike, then what I hear you saying is you agree no meeting in August. I mean, do you want to have a meeting in September to discuss what you got done and not really be taking input from us? Or do you want to think about it?
We're certainly, prepared, to participate in a meeting in September.
Maybe you want to just present the plan. I mean, I don't know.
I mean,
I don't want to waste your time either. I mean, you guys it's going to be crunch time.
Well, I mean, another way to look at it is if everybody understands that they need to unilaterally get their comments after today, unilaterally get their comments to us from now through the end of the comment period. But understanding that after that, we're going to take the information we have and we're going to craft this plan based on that input. Maybe having, it's the will of the group and the will of the chair. I wouldn't try to influence that one way or another, but if you want a meeting where we present the plan, it may be that the October meeting, it will be issued,
really
and then we can
yeah.
talk about it
Right,
and
right,
have
right.
input. So I don't in any way want to discourage anybody from providing continued input on the plan, but I do want everyone to realize that there's a lot that goes into getting that finalized, and we can't be taking fundamental comments into the third week of September. That's just
Well, and I know from experience that there are also going to be legislators who start to have solid waste ideas for things, and they're going to start asking you for input. So there's going to be a lot of stuff going on. So I think this is sort of it, folks, plus whatever private communications you make. And so definitely no meeting in August, and almost certainly no meeting in September, I think, unless we come. I don't know. I'll think about that, but then in October you'll be presenting the plan.
I want to ask a question. You brought up something I thought was very important a little earlier, where you said that you feel like this report lacks heart. I think it was, or punch. And as it moves forward from here, if we don't add something to this thing, it's going to lack that heart and punch going forward into an official document. Now, whether any comments get incorporated or not, obviously, even within the working group, comments are getting, diluted to the point where, I'm not sure how effective they are. So I think that we need to be careful about just sort of like passing this along and letting this thing go through the way it is, even though I understand it's not a document that's etched in granite. But if we don't take this opportunity to put that heart into this thing right now, I'm afraid that this document is going to, I know how these bureaucracies work. I've been working in one for 30 years. I get how this works. If we don't do this now, I think we're going to miss an opportunity.
If I could provide some input here, I think it's important to understand this is a plan that is directed. Its content is largely determined by statute. It's just a framework for it, and I agree with. I am anxious to hear, certainly not only this group's input, but the public's input on this. I think we're going to learn a lot, and I think the plan that gets issued will look substantially different from the one that's in front of you right now, and that's a good thing. That's why we do this process. Having said that, maybe for the reasons I stated earlier about, it is a plan that is primarily a DES product that we have to implement, and we have certain strictures that we need to work under the statute and the way we do our work as an executive branch agency. What I'm hearing too is that this group isn't constrained by all those things, right? You all can talk about anything you want, any way you want to talk about it, and come up with ideas. And again, this is not something that needs to happen right away, but I think it would be entirely appropriate and probably very helpful, not only for the agency, but for the public at large, if this group were to work up something like a legislative action plan, where you identify what you want to accomplish as a state, what we need to accomplish, all of us partners. And this group could publish a legislative action plan that represents a consensus view of the group for what you want to accomplish. And I think that you'd be a little bit less constrained than what this plan does. You don't have a statute telling you what your legislative action plan should look like. It would just be the group's own creation. So it's something just to think about for the coming months, you know, whether that's something, and again, you know, we're getting very close to the next legislative session, so I'm not suggesting it be for the 2023 session, but this group exists for 5 years, and I think that, you know, a legislative action plan could be a really helpful guidance document and could help legislators understand not only what the agency is looking at, but what all the stakeholders that are in this room are thinking the state needs in order to move forward.
So that brings up another point, and that is that our group is required to issue an interim report that I think is November 30th. So when we meet to hear about the plan, you know, I think one of the big accomplishments, obviously, of the group is working with DES in the development of the plan, but we can put more things in the report if we want to. But it's going to have to be, it has to be issued by November 30th, so we can see what all we want to be putting in there, so you guys can think about that. Okay, it's 10:30. I think we deserve a stretch. And why don't we come back? I'm going to make it 7 innings. So why don't we try to come back in less than 10 minutes, okay? And I want to get going at 20 of 11. Mull over what we've been talking about. We only have a little while left to get everything in here that we have to talk about. So let's make it the best that we can do. Thank you. Have a gavel.
That's right. You need a gavel.
All right. So I think we need to be pretty directed here in the next hour and 15 minutes. So I suggested that we look at the overall themes. We could also look at the goals. I think the goals are pretty much set in stone. If we wanted to set priorities, are there things people wanted to say here? I mean, take it away. My ardent wish is that we not waste any of the precious time that we have left. So
2 quick things occurred to me this morning that would be great if they could go in here, I think. One was we said that maybe this should specifically state, maybe in the summary, that these are our priorities and DES will set up actionable goals and schedules or something. And then the other one that we've referred to so many times, maybe it should say right in here, this is a living document and we anticipate addendums periodically, or addendums, I don't want to go too prescriptive, but biennially or whatever, you know what I mean? I'd like to see both of those maybe work their way in here.
or yeah, maybe say something like this plan recognizes that that you know, over 10 years things can evolve and this and it can be. Jim was just saying that he wanted something in here that anticipated that, or recognized the fact that this is a living document.
Yeah, we anticipate some sort of addendum process periodically, maybe. Keep the words pretty general.
Would that be public comment or public input if you were to change that document? Or is it?
I think we would probably I mean, Mike, you can respond to that. If we amended it, then
I think
the same process.
it could be entirely appropriate to, you know, have a draft amendment, put that out for comment, and then, you know, we wouldn't be working under any specific deadline necessarily. So once the agency and the group decided on an appropriate amendment or an addendum, we could put it out to comment.
Yeah.
That'd be appropriate.
Makes a lot of sense, because certain things I imagine are going to get sorted in the next couple of years, like PFAS. We're going to figure out, do we regulate it at parts per quadrillion, or is it not so bad? I would think certain things are going to get sorted out that this should address.
Well, and it's also important, I think, to understand, you know, this is a high-level plan that guides the work that the agency does and that we do with our partners. Each year, we'll, you know, have basically an action, you know, an implementation plan for for that, and where we can track, you know, we'll say these are the things we want to accomplish this year. We can track those and report on those to the public and to this group, you know, and how we're doing. So, you know, we'd like to take a very sort of disciplined approach to our work implementing this plan. We haven't really had the luxury of doing that over the recent years because we've been so constrained, but if we can manage to keep the staff that we have and the budget that allows us to have the staff that we have now, we're going to be positioned to work, to prioritize our work. Not going to be able to do everything, but we'll be able to prioritize our work through implementation plans each year and then track how we're doing on those. And so, and with respect, if the plan is high level, it won't necessarily need to have a specific addendum to the plan. What really, the meat and potatoes of what's going to be happening is in those annual implementation plans and action plans. And so that's something that, you know, we'll be able to communicate with this group about moving forward, you know, throughout the duration of the group.
So to that end, it was kind of hit at the end. The implementation plan should be presented, discussed with this group, I guess, just so everyone's up, because we're going to have to do some kind of reporting for our lifetime of this group.
Yeah, after 5 years though.
Yeah.
We don't, whoever authored the legislation that put this brilliant group together, I don't know it. Anyway, we only have one interim report. One is this come November 30th and then one after the 5 years. But that doesn't mean we can't do more in between.
Right. Well, I'm just saying that the implementation stuff, because we already seen one amendment to this group's charge, so
Right.
just make sure
I mean,
everyone is.
it's going to be evolved. I bet
Yeah.
we get more.
Yeah, but I'm just, so everything kind of connects together as we go forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, our plans for implementation are something we're going to be communicating regularly about with this group. And whether you have a reporting requirement or not is neither here nor there. I mean, we'll be communicating with you about that. It's going to be relevant to the work that you're doing and the discussions that you have as you meet over time.
Well, the reason I was bringing that up is because it helps us write our report when we know what things are being implemented.
I mean, I'm not anticipating that the November 30th report that we write is going to have a huge amount in it. I mean, we can see what's in there, but anyway, okay.
Well, as we think about what to cover next, I was going to suggest we look at section 5, ongoing plan evaluation, because Mike had included a question here for us, which is
let's look at the questions.
what metrics can be used to track progress and who can provide that data. And I think, I mean, my initial reactions in large part, the more concrete and specific we can make each of those actions and make it clear who is the party who is maybe in charge of advancing that action, who are the partners that need to be involved, it will then be more obvious what metrics we're using to track progress, if that makes sense.
What page are you on? That's
It's
seven.
page 17.
Oh, 17.
17.
Yeah.
So I wasn't sure if maybe the staff had sort of more specific information they were looking for, but that was just my general sense, is that if each action is as clear as possible, then I feel like it will be more obvious how we track progress towards meeting that action.
I'm not speaking for the staff, but just from my read of this, you know, they're talking about changing some of the annual reporting forms. So that's one of the ways that they can track how things are going. We may discuss that in general terms about their data collection and looking at that data, and part of their biannual reports will reflect that. So I would imagine that maybe there's some change to the biannual reporting that addresses what the plan is talking about as well. And what that looks like, we'll see.
I mean, one thought that I've had is that I wonder what data the staff feels they could use that they don't now get to help meet the goals. And I'm not expecting you to answer at this point, but I mean, that may be something that can be done through the power of the DES, or if you need something more. I know we've talked about it, but I think your ability to track how we're doing is just really key to all of this. And I think you have that as a short term.
Mark, it seems one area that would be helpful is, just as you mentioned, Karen, about identifying areas that DES needs help with, but I can't help but think, as we're talking about this plan, that this is not an NHDES solid waste plan. This is a much larger umbrella, and I think as part of this effort, what also needs to be done is identify other players that need to be brought to the table. And it's not clear in the plan who those other players are, that this isn't all on the shoulders of DES. I think there are a number of other players that need to be included, and I think we have an opportunity, even if we can't identify those players now, to go back to something that was said a moment ago about this being a fluid document, that a very short-term goal would be to do just that, identify those players. And as part of that kind of short-term goal would also include identifying necessary legislation to accomplish things as was discussed by Duncan about the establishment of infrastructure. And maybe it's not just legislation, maybe there's, as Director Wimsatt mentioned a few moments ago, about things such as tax incentives. But I think there needs to be some, not just ongoing plan evaluation, but ongoing plan work to identify some of those other items that there's no way we're going to have by the time this report is established. So I think if we can at least identify those as critical needs, that that should be in the plan as well. Again, identifying the fluidity of this, but the need of that information, I think, is critical.
Well, as far as outreach, there are definitely more players that we have to outreach to than municipalities. I mean, I think businesses are going to have a huge role in all of this, so maybe sort of the development of a broader outreach plan or something like that for the goals. Senator?
One of the things the department talked about is annual action plan. I think that ought to be into that section, however you're going to word it, because that would be one of the things you're doing for evaluation.
I do want to emphasize that I think this plan needs to stay high level, and how we, what I don't want to do is have a plan that says, you said you're going to do it a certain way, and then 2 years later we find a better way to do it, and we have to amend the plan in order to do that. These are implementation strategies and the way that we do our work.
But in your statement, you said that your department is going to develop these annual action plans, okay? And all I'm saying is you put that in here. If you're going to develop annual action plans, the department will develop annual action plans and check the progress and report to the committee, you know, as needed. I'm trying to get something concrete in that paragraph.
Okay, well, let's jot down that, we'll put in that comment. I mean, actually, Reagan, you identified a good thing. There were things that they asked us specifically for input on, and I don't know that we've done that.
Well, the parties was one of the questions.
Right. Okay, so there was okay. So on page 7, should we allocate tasks to specific entities, and if so, how do we do that? I mean, I think we've talked about that a lot.
Maybe just for clarity on that one, since I seemed really confused, maybe you could say on page 7, under 1 through 8, which entity we're talking about. Department of Health and Human Services, you know what I mean? That might help. If it wasn't for Reagan showing me where they were in the document, I wouldn't know who the entities were. So maybe they should go right in front of us.
Well, to the extent that's possible.
Yeah, yeah,
Some of them
understood.
are just really, broad. There's a lot of players, yeah.
Maybe, maybe not.
I think that's kind of addressed in some of the specific goals, like goal 6.2 names TOT specifically for that. I think it's there.
It's definitely there.
In some cases. So let's just see the other thing. Where else was there here?
Page 14.
Yeah. So it says, do we have specific recommendations for strengthening the section on local markets? I see I had a note here, I said that maybe there's something we wanna put in here about seeking grant opportunities, but maybe that's just sort of a generic thing, but I didn't see it called out specifically in there.
The only thing I think would make it, for actions, they're listed in order, maybe not in a prioritized order, but I would think reestablishing the marketing development coordinator as a higher action, because then some of these other actions can come out of that identified role.
Did anybody else have any other, we could just move it up.
Yeah, and I'm thinking because that job, I don't know what the job description is specifically, but that, that's where the rubber is going to meet the road, is someone's taking the lead on making that happen. I'm not sure that this group is knowledgeable enough of recycling markets as a whole to really understand how that drives in the state.
Is that the kind of thing, Mike, that maybe the agency might want to have as a short-term priority? Or maybe that's too definitive. You're thinking about your staffing. I just thought I mentioned.
Yeah, I'm reluctant to identify that.
No problem. Anybody else have any other comments on that?
I just noted that there's 10 actions here, which is more than several of the other sections, so in some ways it doesn't feel like, to me at least, that it's lacking.
Yeah, okay. And then we already did page 17, I think. Page 18 was a pretty specific question, what terms should be included in the glossary. I think that if folks feel like, if somebody has a general comment there, but otherwise maybe we could send it in separately to the staff. Obviously acronyms, you've done a lot of acronym defining within the context of the document. That should go there. I thought maybe you would want to put a little bit more about PFAS, since that's such a huge issue. And then some of the more advanced technologies like anaerobic digestion. I keep forgetting the term solid waste facility includes transfer station, for instance, so I thought maybe we could put that in there. You used the term universal waste. I didn't really understand what that meant, stuff like that. And then the only other thing, I hope as an appendix, even if it's just a link, we should put the biennial report here, because there'll be a lot of data in there. I think you could just put a link to it. You wouldn't actually have to attach the document. Did anybody else have any other ideas on this? Okay.
So,
all right.
Just out of curiosity,
Yeah.
Has staff made much progress since this was issued on the appendices? Because it looks like a lot of work.
I've kind of started something on each of them, and I was kind of waiting on this meeting to see where, if anybody had any thoughts on those, but I was going to, send it out to other staff and stuff to start commenting on. And I had a conversation, Mike and I, with Reagan about Appendix B, C, and whether NRRA can provide data for providing like a snapshot of market trends and costs and things like that. So we have started making progress, but it won't be ready for public comment by next week, so.
That was kind of where I was going.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, anybody else have any other ideas on that?
If I may, on the subject of appendices, one thing that Paige and I sort of discussed was the second, I think it's Appendix B, summary of actions listed by waste type. This was kind of driven out of a suggestion from the last meeting that the solid waste working group had, where there were some comments about, you know, it'd be nice if we had actions listed by material type or some way to kind of like have an index of, if you're interested in food waste or you're interested in construction and demolition debris or something like that, you would have a way to kind of like navigate the document a little easier. One of the things we started to do that, and one of the things we discovered is that the document is relatively high level, so it doesn't really delve into a lot of detail about specific material types. So we're kind of not sure if that's really going to be as useful as we thought it was. So we've started going down that road, but I just wanted to mention that to the group, that it's kind of turning out to be not as, it's almost like it wouldn't be as useful as we would have hoped.
Could that be an action item instead to develop that? Because that could take a lot of time and effort. I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah, and I think it is acknowledged in, especially talking about like data and waste characterizations and how that would be helpful to prioritize actions going forward. So yeah, we could consider maybe another action item that more specifically says like targeting specific materials and creating an action plan or something. I don't know.
There could be a lot of work just in that item B to generate it effectively, so it's helpful for everyone. And I'm not sure it'd be worthwhile just to get it out, to get something out when it's not complete. Maybe an action item would be to develop something like that as a follow-up, so you can take your effort away from that and work on all these other things that we're talking about that we suddenly dumped on you today, Mike, when you thought you had a plan that was nearly complete, I think. So that's my thought.
Yeah, I mean, whatever you guys decide.
Yeah, when I first saw the title, I thought it was a lot like C, that it wasn't going back and looking in this document, but was producing a usable appendix for interested readers, right? I think that's really what it would need to be, and that's why it's so much work.
More of a reference tool.
Yeah, it wasn't really going back into the document. It was, because the cost appendix C doesn't do that. I thought it was like C, and it is pretty involved.
If it was a table or a document that was already out there and prepared and flushed out by the agency, I'd say great, include it. But I don't think there's enough time to do that justice.
It almost fits into some of the educational goals that are in here down the road, doesn't it? Like, I think it would be great if one of the educational goals was to provide to any interested stakeholder what is the current state of plastics, you know, reuse, you know what I mean? But it's already in here, but not necessarily by the end of this plan due date. Seems to me anyway.
So my idea is that we start to page through this because we want to have an opportunity to do that. If somebody would like to do something differently, speak now. Okay. All right. Table of contents. So I'll just say, I'm just going to say again what I said before. I would like to suggest to the agency, at least in the beginning here, you put a little bit more in here for why this is so important and just put a little more heart into it. I mean, I think people feel very strongly about this, and this is so very cut and dry. I'd really like to get something in here about why this is so important. And I've read the reports of other states, and they just put a little more in it. And, you know, like, if you have a member of the public or a legislator, they're probably gonna read the first couple of pages. We need to tell them why this matters more clearly, and not just because it's in a statute. So that would just be my general comment on the beginning of it. So I don't know if anybody had anything else on pages 2 or 3.
Is that the appropriate place for context, regional context?
I feel like that's one of the things that should be in there. And, you know, yes.
And I feel like some of that language is in the biennial report, isn't it? I feel like there is more context. If I'm remembering correctly, I feel like the biennial report does have some more regional context. And
The other one did, yeah. The
yeah, so
previous
maybe there's
one
some
did,
language that can be
you
pulled
can-
from there and more
Right.
easily plopped
I mean,
in here.
there was a lot in there. Yeah. I remember from when they wrote it before. I like having the hierarchy in here. I think that's good. Were you gonna say something, Steve?
I was, it's on page 4. This comes out of statute, I think it comes out of statute, so I don't think we can edit it, but just point of reference, the second to the last bullet, infectious waste in healthcare, in laboratory facilities and not solid waste, it's infectious waste, only following sterilization is it a solid waste. So, I mean, that's something the legislature missed when this was prepared. It's not something we can take, we don't want it. If it's gone through autoclave, or it's been incinerated, that's a different conversation, but it's not a solid waste.
Steve, if I could just clarify,
Yeah.
it is in fact a solid waste, it just may not be an authorized solid waste at your facility. So it's regulated as a solid waste, but it requires pre-treatment before it can be disposed in landfill.
I actually had a question here for Mike about sludge, because because sludge is such an issue. So I see in the second set of bullet points it said sludge not disposed of at solid waste facilities, but I know you guys take sludge. I was wondering why it wasn't in the first list.
So it is a weird quirk. Sludge, septic and sludge from wastewater treatment facilities under New Hampshire law is not solid waste unless it is disposed in a landfill. So we have the statute to thank for that. That's the way it is.
I mean, is that bad?
It makes it a little bit awkward when we have these conversations.
It's a regulatory construct, because otherwise, every wastewater treatment facility would need to be a permitted solid waste facility. Every farm field that ever received any sludge or septic for land application would be a solid waste landfill. And nobody wanted that. So,
Right.
so we're gonna regulate it under its own
Well-
structure. But when it goes to a landfill,
Obviously
it
solid
becomes
waste.
regulated solid waste, and it's all the appropriate requirements.
I would argue, given what we know today, that should be revisited. If you look at what's happened in the state of Maine,
Right.
where this
Oh,
was spread all over the
absolutely.
place, it's a problem.
Massachusetts too.
It's a real problem. So I mean, I know the history, I get it, but I'm not sure that's the best practice. If you wanna look for legislation to introduce, I put that near the top of your list.
Well, let's keep going through this. I mean, maybe that's a action item we wanna add somewhere. I don't know if it's reducing toxicity in the stream, but I think I agree with you. I was sort of looking for sludge in here after reading what happened in Maine, and I felt like there should be something here, but I don't know where. The staff will figure it out.
So I think with the short-term goals at the end, and then we're talking again about, doing waste characterizations and identifying toxicity. Once we actually identify some of these low-hanging fruit pieces, then we revisit it and decide where it needs to go. But the first step is to get the data collection, and then it's gonna be a matter of what we do with that data when we get it. So then that's where the action items are gonna come in, is when you see what it is you really have out there, and then what is the first items, and reprioritize as we have discovery of what it what happens with it, like now it's the PFAS, and in Maine it was the sludges, and those things will become apparent as we move through space and time, right?
PFAS is really with us, man. It's just, well, I mean, Mark is on here. I just bumped into a Valley News article about the PFAS problem that they're having in Lebanon, you know? And Mark, you made a comment in the news article, we really got to try to cut this at the front of the pipe and not keep trying to deal with it at the end. And I am looking to, you know, try to bring that theme into the plan. You know, waste reduction is where we've got to go. So.
Mike, does that mean
So that's kind of that idea of bold,
Right.
trying to stop something coming down the pipe. I think this is what we're coming up against, is a much more complicated regulatory landscape than it is to identify 100 regulated entities and make them clean up their act. So this again goes, you know, I'm just gonna say it again, I think this is our opportunity, even if we're looking at these as aspirational goals, however we want to frame them. I think this is our opportunity to say what we'd really like to see, and not necessarily what do we think people have the stomach for. This is our time right now, and I think if to echo something Duncan said earlier, if we don't say it now, I think we're going to miss our opportunity.
I was just going to ask Mike, isn't it more of a procedural intra-agency thing? Like, it's not like sludge is being ignored in New England. It's usually in the wastewater group,
Absolutely.
water group.
We have a specific program within the water
Yeah,
division that regulates
so
sludge and
I'm
stuff.
sure you talk to each other, but I don't think it would be easy to move sludge into the waste management division in any state. Maybe it would, I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's not. At this point, it's very evolutionary, right?
Right.
Information's coming in, and
Right.
we're doing a lot of work to evaluate, you know, what impacts land application has had in the state, as well as what would be considered safe levels of
Right.
PFAS and sludge for land application. So there's a whole, but again, you're absolutely right. There's a whole regulatory structure already. It just doesn't happen to be housed under the solid waste management
Right,
statute
that's what I was
or the
wondering,
solid
yeah.
waste management
Yeah.
program.
Thanks.
Well, I mean, as long as we're talking about PFAS, if people don't mind, so on page 9, that's the section on toxicity. So one of the action items was develop educational resources about PFAS to facilitate informed purchasing decisions. I mean, I don't know if there was something a little stronger we could do as far as action items are concerned. I had made a note, I wanted to make sure there were online resources there too. But then just going to the legislation on page 10, it says on action 2.10, it says consider legislation addressing use of chemicals of concern in consumer products. So I think that would be sort of a bold action, Mark Morgan. Those are, I mean, can you think of other things that you would like to see? Not just you, but maybe you had a thought.
No, those are good starts. Like I mentioned earlier, it's difficult to frame them. I hate to pigeonhole it. I think what I'd like to include is just some mechanism to evaluate what some of those are. My fear is that, I know this is a long meeting, but and we've all been at this for quite some time, is that we pigeonhole the idea, that if we create some framework to evaluate, I know, Duncan was talking about infrastructure, there's a question in the text, what is an advanced recycling facility? All of these definitions feel like they change every 6 months, but if we create some mechanism to at least evaluate those opportunities, that maybe that's a way to build in some fluidness, take some of the burden off of DES. I know, as Mike said, DES doesn't have the authority to do some of this stuff, but to create some other mechanism, I think would be helpful, whether that's through legislation, rule rewriting, public-private partnership, what have you. But think we need to create some sort of openness in that.
Okay, I'm not sure how we would work that in, but that sounds like something more overarching. I was wondering, should we limit this, consider legislation addressing use of chemicals of concern just to consumer products? Could we just
I would say no.
I would say no, me too. I mean, we could remove the in consumer products.
Right, because there's, biomedical, there's a lot of industries, even car washes, generate a fair amount of PFAS.
So, I mean, I would just say as long as we've got that, why limit it to just consumer products?
I would agree.
I mean, it's just becoming a behemoth of a problem. Okay, sorry, I want, because.
Realistic PFAS is just, sort of the chemical du jour.
Yeah, you're right.
A while ago, what's the next PFAS? We don't even know what it is. There's literally thousands of chemical compounds out there that are in consumer products that had no health and safety testing done on it by and large. So, I think that you're talking about tip of the iceberg, and I think that certainly we should be advocating for reduction of toxicity in our waste stream whenever possible. But there's so much we don't know at this point, and when it gets revealed, the barn door is long since opened for it. I mean, how realistically, PFAS compounds themselves have, I think, hundreds of compounds within them, and only a couple of them have been identified as the problems. But the other ones haven't necessarily been tested, as far as I understand. So, it's a big problem.
So what we have is consider legislation addressing use of chemicals of concern, such as PFAS in blah, blah, blah. I mean, I think you could I would just recommend that you guys broaden that out.
Well, yeah, what I'm looking at is you could just say, consider legislation addressing use of chemicals concerned, just put a period there. But if you want to identify, such as, it's just e.g.
Right,
It's just,
right.
here's an example.
I mean, I don't think it's a
broader
bad
statement.
thing to say. I think it's worth mentioning PFAS in particular, considering the world we're living in right now.
So I think if we strike the words in consumer products from that statement, it's a much broader statement.
Yeah.
That one.
Okay. All right. I jumped ahead there because we were talking about PFAS. Did anybody have anything on page, we got 7. 8. I mean, my only I had on goal 1, action 1.1, I wondered about information on appropriate recycling and composting or something like that.
What page you on?
Page 8.
Can we back up? Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
First, the end of the first paragraph on 5.
On 5?
Yeah.
Yep.
Not sure I totally agree with what's stated there, last sentence.
Oh, because of yours? Yeah, can
We're
you?
spending over $10 million as I speak, and it's like, all right, we're not building anything over there. We're managing 24,000 tons a year and servicing 30-something communities to manage their single-stream materials. So, if we were to build a Billerica, and some folks have been at that location,
Right.
we need about 2 times that volume to make it work financially. Otherwise, we're going to charge a crazy number for a tip fee. So, but we are, working with communities on single stream. I've got an edit for you, Mike. I'll send it to you. But basically, identifying this one commercial facility that's
Right.
supporting single stream operations or something. But just say there's no recycling. That's not the case.
I think there may be some confusion on part of our staff, all of us, about what exactly that facility is doing.
Okay.
And we want to understand that, and we can certainly adjust the language in this to reflect that.
for sludge was I was noticing there really wasn't much in here about plastics at all. And I know that's another subject that is of great interest for good reason to an awful lot of people. And I was wondering on page 9 under legislation if we wanted to add an action item 1.10, explore legislation reducing the use of single-use plastics.
But isn't that what
I think
action
it says
1.9
that.
says?
Oh,
So do you.
reduce the use of single, sorry.
I did
Karen?
Control F
Oh.
and searched for all the plastics.
All right.
There's a few.
Okay, the chair made a mistake. It's in there. Sorry about that. But I don't see much about plastics. I think that was about the only reference to it.
Yeah, so if there's something I could call out jumping ahead a bit that ties in with plastics. So if we go to page 12, it also ties in with the EPR here. So if we look at actions on 316 and on 317 in a way. So the EPR calls out specific types of recycling such as batteries, electronic devices, but it doesn't specifically call out the plastics. So my thought was, is there any way we could call out plastics in 316, and then that would essentially eliminate the redundancy in 317 of the bottle bill? Because EPR would be a much more realistic first step, I'm feeling, than the bottle bill based on how many times it's been brought up and shot down in the past. And if we want to do something about plastics, which we all do, this just seems like a more realistic way to call it out as part of EPR rather than have EPR and bottle bill both presented. That was just my 2 cents.
I don't know how people feel.
I think it depends on who you ask if they think that a bottle bill is EPR or not, or if they're two different things.
Yeah, I was just framing it in the, if we went back to the SMART goals that were brought up back in the beginning of this meeting today, how realistic is it that our recommendations are actually put through, and that's what we want to see at the end of the day? So that's just where I was coming at it from. It seems like a more realistic step to list it within EPR rather than bottle bill specifically.
Well, and then the other thing about bottle bills is it also includes glass.
I was just thinking of the plastic, yeah.
What would you want to, I think it's a great idea. What would you want to list there, since when we go to plastics, we immediately think numbers, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What would we list there exactly?
And that's a good question for discussion, but I was just thinking specifically in terms of like plastic bottles that like we would see out in public and whatnot, but I get where you're going. We would have to think about the different numbers.
Right.
It was just a thought.
I mean, if I had a comment about 3.16, I think adding the word plastics there would certainly be helpful, because I think we need to think about it more broadly than, I realize including doesn't limit, but it seems like a very specific list, and I think we should be thinking more broadly about it. I mean, why don't we put plastics in there for starters?
Or packaging more broadly.
Or packaging, yeah,
Maybe that's
definitely. I mean, maybe when the staff looks at this, maybe you just broaden that out a little bit more. I think that list may have come from a couple of things that we had in my recycling committee report, but I definitely think we should be thinking more broadly about it, and it's worth mentioning it in the action.
Why does it say certain appliances at the end of that? Why is certain in there?
Yeah, I don't know. Let's cross out certain. I don't know. You get the point, you guys.
We could put it uncertain.
Mattresses is good to leave there, though.
So one last thing while we're still on that, I know you also called out glass, as in the bottle bill would also focus on plastic and glass. Could we go as far as to include that within EPR as well, in order of a more realistic substitute for like how it would do in the legislature and whatnot? Because if glass is still a focus, we could also call it out there instead, rather than have 2 separate action items for it.
I mean, I don't know how people feel. I think a lot of people feel really, really strongly about the bottle bill on both sides, so. I mean, I'm just gonna let the staff ponder on that one. But thanks for bringing it up. I mean, I think it's important that we get plastics in our, and packaging in our other lists.
My comment on 316 was, maybe it doesn't move, but should EPR type things be under goal 1, which is reduce the quantity of solid waste generated, versus in goal 3 where it's you're doing the diversion, because if it's an EPR program, you're not generating the waste.
Put it in both.
EPR, there still can be a waste. The extended producer responsibility can take a lot of different forms.
I don't know.
EPR for paint, it's still paint waste. People still have paint waste. But where manufacturers expected to provide a means for managing that waste. That's what EPR for paint means. It might mean something different for plastics or packaging or whatever it might be, but I don't think it's necessarily always reducing waste. It may just be providing a cost-effective way that is borne by the manufacturer. It's again, it's extended producer responsibility for the waste that are generated from their activities. It may result in them designing their product in a way that reduces waste. So it goes to one, but there's almost always going to be some waste, and a component of EPR is putting the onus on the manufacturer to provide an outlet for managing that waste, as opposed to just leaving it to the consumer to figure it out.
Yeah, I'm just thinking from the consumer's perspective that if it goes back somewhere, it's no longer my waste, so I'm just reducing my quantity. So it's a different perspective.
Well, you're talking to a waste regulator, so you're talking to the wrong guy about that.
Going back up a little bit, I had a comment on action 3.8 on page 11. So the second sentence of 3.8 talks about considering regulatory changes, and so I thought that sentence should just be moved to, the regulatory update section.
The second sentence.
The second sentence.
Yeah. You see where that is?
3.8.
So on page 11, action item 3.8, the second sentence, it says consider regulatory changes to make it easier.
I think that's right. Because that's under the heading of public outreach education.
All right, page 12.
Hey, are we gonna go back to that, please?
Yeah?
Yeah, can we back up before
But I
that?
just think that put this part into this thing. So after the first sentence on goal 3, maximize the diversion. When waste is generated, it should be diverted, et cetera, et cetera. After it says, and other methods to avoid disposal in landfills and incinerators, insert the following. Without new and expanded infrastructure from public and or private sector, there will be no meaningful progress to the stated goals of this plan.
Where is that inserted, Duncan?
What was that?
Where do you want it?
At the end of the second
Right
sentence.
after it says, downstream approaches such as recycling, composting, and other methods that avoid disposal in landfills and incinerators. I think it needs a further statement that says, without new and expanded infrastructure from public and or private sector, there will be no meaningful progress to the stated goals of this plan.
Okay, they're writing that down. Thank you, it's a good point.
Well, then furthermore, when we get, since we were sort of jumping ahead, I would suggest that in the legislative action, when we talked about this before, so maybe it could be, and actually it fits better in front of the current action 3.14, but action 3.14 could now say,
goal 2, second line, hazardous waste and materials containing toxic chemicals. If that's the case, you can't dispose of anything, because everything we've got has toxic chemicals in it. I'd like to suggest that we include concentrated levels of toxic chemicals or something. I mean, the PFAS is a good example, right? It's in everything. It's in the wrappers you buy at Burger King. It's in the carpeting, you know, that you're tearing up. Unfortunately, it's in many different municipal solid waste items, so somehow just a distinction, maybe concentrated levels of toxic chemicals or something. Because everything's got toxic chemicals, otherwise we're going to be lying in landfills, right?
Which action is that?
It's just the introduction.
Oh, okay.
I've got that in text, I'll send it to you if you can consider putting it in.
So the issue really is materials contained.
Well, it's the concentrated levels of it, right?
No, I understand, but like, you know, there's a difference of having a jar of PFAS that you dispose of versus, you know, a wrap that may have, you know, have waterproofing on it. So it's the concentration difference. It's also the volume difference. I mean, there's a lot of, I guess, like you said, everything contains PFAS. You're not going to get all that out of the waste stream.
Right. That's what I'm trying to get across is that, you know, the concentrated levels of these forever chemicals, for better than lack of a better term, is the problem, right? If you throw away your Gore-Tex jacket that has a toxic chemical in it, you can't take it.
Right.
The list can go on. We can't accept any MSW from Burger King or McDonald's because of the wrappers that are in that dumpster out there. I don't think that's the intent of this. I know it's not. Somewhere just for clarity, it might be worth to say there's a threshold, some of it's going to be true.
So I think that,
acknowledge that it's coming.
well, I think that crosses over into the rec rules of hazardous waste, you know, established by the EPA. So that's, you know, that's a whole different set of rules, as you know. So I think, I wonder if that language is just not in the right place. I think is it more about exploring new technologies to better manage the toxicity of our wastes? Is that really not what we're trying to accomplish, right? So it's how can we better manage the toxicity level of our waste today than to say that we're not going to have toxicity in our waste, because that's driven by the consumer, right? And like you said, it's your Gore-Tex jacket that you're throwing away.
I mean, as
so
I
how do you
read,
then manage the waste?
sorry.
No,
I mean,
go ahead.
I just read that as a very general statement that we're trying to reduce the toxicity in the waste stream. I don't read that as, I mean, it's not even in an action item. It's just like this general goal that we want to reduce it. I mean, that's how I read it.
Can I just comment? This is getting at the comment that everyone always makes that PFAS and these kinds of chemicals should be addressed upstream.
Right.
I think what we're getting stuck in is this mode of thinking that it needs to be addressed in the
Downstream.
waste stream.
Right.
And this is trying to get at source reduction and the idea that these things need to be managed in a way or
They're not
basically not
generated.
introduced into commerce in a way that is going to affect the waste stream.
Right. Which is why we're talking about them in this section.
Right.
So, okay. On that page, action 2.2, I just wanted to make sure we include the concept that the educational resources include the online resources. Small comment. Okay.
But back onto that, what we talked before, PFAS is just, you know, chemical du jour.
Right.
Do you want to broaden that?
You wanna call that emerging contaminants instead of PFAS?
Or, I mean, the term we used otherwise was chemicals of concern. Is that a defined term somewhere? chemicals of concern?
It's an industry kind of standard term.
I think Mark's got a better point. There's a lot of things besides PFAS that are problematic.
Right.
We shouldn't limit to PFAS.
Well, we have, yeah, right,
They can-
such as, or however you wanna do it. But if chemicals of concern is a jargony type thing, we might wanna put that in the glossary, cause I wondered if that was in a statute or something.
I mean, I think you just take PFAS out and make it, he said, make it broader, more generic, because it seems to really target it.
My only thought would be for somebody from the public reading this, it might be helpful to call out a specific item. But if you guys wanna come up with some other,
I mean, that first sentence, I think you just, household hazardous waste and materials containing toxic chemicals, and that's the end of the sentence. Or like some level of, toxicity is a relative term,
Yeah, that's the problem.
and it depends on the dose, really.
I guess the concern I would have is, I mean, we try to talk about overarching what we want to do in the paragraph description of the goal, and then we have some more specific action items. In the same way that you were offended that plastics wasn't noted enough. A lot of people could be offended that, geez, DES has 87 people working full time on PFAS, and you didn't even mention it in your plan. So I think that
Sorry, Mike.
well, I mean, I think you hear the comment and maybe PFAS is, personally, I'd like to see the PFAS reference in here, but we could add like, and other chemicals of concern or involve, whatever, you
Yeah, I
get
think
the point.
actually 2.2 kind of covers it. It calls it out right there.
I think you get the point. I mean, I would argue that not the whole, we know a lot about, I mean, we hear a lot about PFAS, but not everybody does, and in reading this, if that educates them more, I think we're also achieving that goal.
What you could do after that is PFAS, comma, and other chemicals of emerging concern, comma, and they can,
Something like
Putting
that.
those two together makes sense to me.
Well, I mean, maybe you can just come up with that sort of a term that you can use on a recurrent basis where the idea comes up. Okay, page 12, 13.
It's really just a curiosity. Action 3.18 on page 12. Is it really the hauler that's the issue here? I don't have a huge perspective in New Hampshire, but the business and the consumer can, in many, many places in the state, can get their recyclables hauled away. It's usually their will that prevents it. It seems to me, not the hauler's will, unless you're talking about a really small hauler. You know what I mean? I wonder if 3.18 is getting at the true intent or spirit. I mean, you can require the hauler to do that, and I think they already do most of them. But do we really want to say it's require the businesses? You know, I'm just curious. And why does Dunkin' Donuts not recycle its number 5 plastics? It's not because the haulers they hire wouldn't do it. You know what I mean?
I think it was about Vermont. Vermont required haulers to offer.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, are we hitting the right problem? It's fine as is, I'm just asking for my own information. Is that really, maybe Reagan or Steve, is that really the issue?
I think it's a fair question. I mean, I think what, if you look at, these are private businesses that run these operations, and having the infrastructure and the capability to provide both straight MSW collection and recyclables collection costs money.
Right, sure.
And if you are doing that, and then you've got someone who just comes and said, I'll just pick up all the trash unsorted for, and
Right.
they don't spend any effort or money to develop that capability and develop that ability, then they're going to get undercut by the guys who are doing that. So, and again, this is explore. I'm not saying, that's it.
Yeah, that's true.
It nibbles around the edges of telling businesses what to do, which New Hampshire legislature generally doesn't like to do. But it is a question that comes up because, if all of a sudden anybody with a truck can be a solid waste hauler, and they don't have to have any capacity to do anything sophisticated or provide any expanded resources, they're going to be able to undercut the other guys every
Gotcha.
time, and that's the issue that we're trying to
Yeah.
explore here.
It
Again,
makes
not-
sense, makes sense leaving it then, thanks, I appreciate it.
Well, I think it's good to have the spaghetti throwing against the wall, but, anybody who's operated a solid waste facility sort of, knows that, it's very difficult, when you have a packer truck that's, disgorging 10 tons of material that's been picked up curbside, and, out comes stuff that you are, is part of a solid waste ban of some sort, you still have to manage it in some way, so, Mark alluded to this earlier, that, the big problem of waste management in general is that we're basically managing the end of the pipe when the problem happens at the beginning of the pipe, but there's no, reasonable way to get at the beginning of the pipe, because education by itself isn't necessarily going to do it. People are going to do what they're going to do. Ask any operator who's had their presence left for them at the gate, or, or seeing a packer truck unloading, a huge amount of stuff that is not supposed to be there. It happens, all day, every day. So I think it's great to throw that spaghetti against the wall, extend and producer responsibility. I'm not gonna dismiss it out of hand, but I think the reality of the situation is that the management of this is gonna come from the end of the pipe, not the beginning, realistically, given consumer behavior and the difficulty of getting messages out and enforcing bans. I mean, you can enforce anything you want as long as you have the resources to do it, but I suspect that DES doesn't have the resources to be the trash police insofar as they can.
All right, where are we? 12, 13. 14. So, starting on 13 and going over here, the legislation regarding solid waste management, planning, and formation. Does this get into the solid waste, the SWIP idea at all?
Where are you?
So it's the bottom of page 13, the legislative action 4.7, page 13 and to the top of 14. I guess this is just gonna be sort of looking at what municipalities do with respect to solid waste management.
I think this is articulating we've got a structure in the statute that says that every town's got to be part of a solid waste district.
Yeah.
They can be their own district, and that requirement has largely been ignored over time by the communities. We had a lot of people in the agency working hard on that. Mark Morgan was one of them many years ago, and there was a pretty robust group of solid waste districts. But over time, they kind of fell apart without sort of constant care and feeding from the agency. That's not what they wanted to do. And so what I think this is getting at is revisiting that and saying, is that necessary in order to be successful here? And do we need to strengthen that legislation or change the way we implement it? Or should we be looking at saying, you know what, that dog won't hunt and there's another way to do it, and what's on the books right now has proven itself to be unsuccessful and should be repealed? And I don't know the answer to that. I think it's something we really do need to explore. But it's
there's merit in that question, and I'm tempted to say that I think that the future looks better for districts than the past. As solid waste costs escalate, as distance to disposal and recycling facilities increase, I think it's important for for communities to work together to accomplish this problem. We can look to some of our neighboring states and see how county government has done well in managing this particular issue. So I would encourage keeping solid waste districts in this, whether we call them solid waste districts or cooperative opportunities. I think there's merit in that. I do have a comment about goal 4. In that first sentence, it ends with the phrase waste management hierarchy, And to go along with a point that was made earlier about the general public reviewing this document, the way this is written, it almost sounds like it doesn't say landfills, but it doesn't specifically explain what an integrated system would be. And I don't have any suggested language, but I think a sentence or two in there would be helpful to include things like, you know, material recovery facility, recycling centers, transfer stations. Simply saying all levels of the waste management hierarchy, I'm not sure how that's addressed in that introduction to this goal. Because the solid waste hierarchy includes waste reduction, and what sort of capacity would we be building to address waste reduction? Again, I just throw that comment out there. I don't have any suggested language, but it's just not clear.
Just trying to find these statutes. I think one of these statutes is what requires towns to do have an operating plan, solid waste management operating plan. So I think it has more to it's not just to do with solid waste districts. Anyway, I think it's a good goal, so let's just leave it. 14, 15. So again, maybe it's here and I didn't see it. I've read several articles about generating energy, you know, and I know that methane is used to generate energy. I thought that if we're trying to achieve climate change goals, the concept of using waste that can't be reduced or recycled to help generate energy, I thought that we should refer to that in here. At least in that first paragraph.
So we do have one action item 6.4 that talks about exploring options to generate energy from waste using landfill gas, as well as alternative technologies using anaerobic digestion and pyrolysis.
Okay.
Is that what you're getting
Yeah,
at?
but I wanted to also have it in the
Got it.
yeah, in the first paragraph.
That's part of the challenge is that
I know.
so many of these belong in various
In
different
various
spots. I mean, we
places.
talk about infrastructure in plenty of places other than just the infrastructure section.
Right.
But, yeah.
I just think up here would be helpful too. Okay, I actually don't have anything else, so let's see, that was page 15, 16, 17, I think we beat to death. Does anybody have anything else that they want to say generically or specifically? I just had one other thing I just realized that I've in the intro and then at the end here, they talk about, there's a reference in here to a range of stakeholders, including DES, solid waste industries, and they use the term non-governmental organizations. I think the thought was to include all, but I really feel like we should put the word businesses in here because their participation in all of this is really critical. I tend to think of NGOs as nonprofits, so I just would recommend putting the word business in that laundry list in the introduction and then at the end. So, anybody have anything else?
Why isn't New Hampshire done recording?
We are really important. Let's see. Why are we stakeholders? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I get what you mean.
Because there could really be an unlimited list of stakeholders.
I think, for example, that there are a lot of legislative items in this plan.
Okay.
So that the input of the general court will be necessary for
So I would say, sort of in closing, is that this has been really helpful. We're going to do our very best to go back and try to incorporate some of this into the draft, but our goal is, and we will need it, is to get this thing out for public comment. So please don't be offended if your idea didn't make it to this draft. It goes out for public comment. It doesn't mean we aren't still considering it and working on this for the final draft. But our goal here is to make sure we get this out and give the public an opportunity to really review it, provide us with their feedback. So,
So at this point, I just want to sort of think about the meeting, because we had talked about this before. So we're definitely not meeting in August. At this point, I don't want to issue a cancellation order, but I'm not sure meeting in September is useful, especially because it's going to be really crunch time for the agency to get the plan out. So then, what we might want to do is meet a little bit earlier in October, so we will get the benefit of the presentation about the plan, but we can also start to ruminate a little bit about what we want to put in our own report, because our report will be due November 30th, and then we'll just have one more meeting, which would be in November. So anyway.
I don't see how you get the report out by October 1st without this group commenting on the public comments and what you're going to incorporate or not incorporate from that.
Well, I think the timing is just really, really challenging, because we've got the we've got the public comment period, and then they have to incorporate them if we want to meet the October 1st deadline.
Which ones should they incorporate? That's my question. All right. I thought this group here was going to help decide which ones were going to get incorporated. No?
I mean,
what causes the report to go out? This group, right?
no, it's just the statute is October 1st, it says it has to go out, and we're just providing input.
with respect, the solid waste working group's role is to provide input to the agency in its preparation of the solid waste management plan. And we take that very seriously. We not only take everything that's happened to now and today, but we're very interested in anything that is provided to us over the next month or so. Having said that, it is not a situation, as I understand it, and probably wouldn't even be appropriate for like the group to vote on whether they approve the plan, because that is not a role or a mandate that the group was provided by the legislature. So I think that we could. It's difficult because we also have this whole other group we call the general public, which I think will provide us with a lot of input on this. And to be honest and very candid, we're going to need every day in September to review that, evaluate it, and make a decision about how the plan gets amended, both from the comments we receive from the solid waste working group as well as the public. And I don't know how we would, if we have a meeting, you could pick any day in September, but if we have a meeting in September, we're not going to be prepared to give this group what we will not have yet processed all that information. So we're going to give you something that looks a lot like what we will release in the next few days for public comment, and I don't know how that would help the group. So I just think it's, if we had 6 more months, we could have another meeting and maybe have a near final draft that you can take a look at and provide your comment on. But I just don't think we're going to, given the schedule that we have now, I don't think there's an opportunity for the agency to take significant input from this group in a formal setting again and get this published on time, which we do intend to do.
So I'm looking at the bill. I don't necessarily think that everything that you said is the way the bill says.
Okay.
It's the function of the group is to review and recommend methods to better provide. Review and recommend. review and recommend, review other such matters. Again, I'm gonna see the thing on the other end, you know, when it comes to the legislation. So, but I'm just very surprised, all these groups that I've been on, that we go get public input and that goes to the department and doesn't come back to the group. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
My instincts are to make a commitment to you that I can't keep. And I'm not going to do that. I always want to give due respect to these group people who give their time and volunteer, and to legislators who do the same. But I don't know how we can get, but by October 1, with what we're doing, I don't know how we can get a meaningful opportunity for this group to weigh in yet again on a draft of the plan. In order to do that, we would have to take your comment, we'd have to work on it over the next month, give you a new draft without any regard to the public comment that we received, which is very important, and then take your comments on that. So it would still be a very incomplete and imperfect exercise.
Well, if your comment period is like the month of August, okay, and you have a meeting, you know, early in September that says, okay, here's the comments we've had, we're looking at, you know, certain parts of it. Again, I'm just very surprised that this group is not getting to weigh in on the final verdict. Surprised.
Calendar is what's conspiring against us here. We just don't know how we can. And credit to this group, who just, you know, really got stood up, you know, less than a year ago. You have focused your attention mightily with a large group of people who have a lot of responsibilities to give us input. And I think it's been very constructive and very timely and very helpful. But you know, it's the will of the group. I'm just one member of the group.
Well, I mean, my problem is that you have a deadline of October 1st, and you've made many commitments that that the agency is gonna issue it on the deadline, and there's a lot of people that really wanna see this report by the deadline. And, you know, if you had a staff of 10, maybe you could get through the public comments more quickly, but it's not an ideal world.
So our charge isn't to approve the plan.
That's correct.
Right, so, but to the senator's point, you know, is there a way for this group to understand what the comments of the public are?
Probably what we could do without a lot of post-processing is to compile the comments that we receive and send them out to the group in an email communication, which we could do close to the end, you know, soon after the comment period ends.
What do you usually do with regulations, proposed draft regulations? Are all the comments public, or what's
sure.
that?
Any comments we receive are public,
And you put them, I mean, so we could access them.
Sure,
You
no,
give us a link.
Absolutely, no, we can provide that in almost real, you know, once the comment period closes, we can provide all of those comments to you. And we're happy to do that.
And considering it's a living document, like, so we gotta meet our deadline, you can incorporate what you can, whatever our next meeting is, October or whatever, there might be an initiative to, within whatever time period that is, these are amendments we would like to agree on as a group to put back out there, so.
Well, and we can even put it in our report, because we have a report opportunity. I mean, I think, Mike, the thing is, you get the public comments, the staff has to incorporate them, and then there's a review period further up the
We need the whole month to get this
chain.
done right.
Right.
You
And
won't
I
like the
know-
result if we don't have that.
Yeah.
I can assure you of that.
Yeah. And as I say, there's probably gonna be people starting to come at you with legislative ideas too.
And I mean, I would just say as a legislator, it's really important that we get it out in a timely fashion because that's sort of our action plan. So I do have, I have one question. Do you think that, you'll probably have some sort of an executive summary at the beginning of the plan?
I
Would
think
that be a goal?
Given the comments that we saw here, I think that's right. We will incorporate a section like that.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, very, very much. Everybody's put a whole lot of work in, and I know the staff really appreciates it. I appreciate it. I mean, this group came together as part of legislation that I addressed, and I know a lot of people care a lot about what we're doing, and I hope we've fulfilled their expectations. As far as I'm concerned, I think we've worked really hard, and we're all doing the best we can do for the state in this important matter. So thank you very much. Thank you to the staff. Thanks to the public who now it's your turn to chip in, and so I guess we'll wrap it up with that. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.